Hello, my name is Eric Ford. This is part of my summer 2020 series on management during the pandemic and other social issues of the season. And I'd like to talk to you this evening about corporate social responsibility. In particular, this slide deck is called From Corporate Social Responsibility to Creating Shared Value. The idea of corporate social responsibility has been in the management field for a number of years now. And a lot of it moves from the traditional view of the corporation as having one purpose, and that is to maximize the value to the shareholder. This was something that was put forth by Milton Friedman, to a more balanced approach where a corporation has a duty not only to the shareholder, but to the people it employs, the communities that they operate in, and society at large. And even then, we've moved beyond corporate social responsibility, CSR, to something called creating shared value, which is an even more expansive idea. I should give credit to this idea to Dr. Michael Porter of Business School, who's best known for his 5 forces model that most of you will see in this or other courses, depending on which class you're taking. So to move to even a bigger picture than the corporation, we can start to think about how nations are developing, and are nations developing things that matter beyond just their own gross domestic product, gross national product, etc. If you don't mind, please mute your mic so that we don't hear the background noise. All right. We could have a wager on how many of these are going to occur during each lecture. So one of the things we can do is move beyond GDP and measure how a nation is doing in other ways. We can talk about a human development index. This is something that's already available. There's something called the Millennium Development Indicators, the Happy Planet Index, perhaps the country of Bhutan, which is a kingdom that's very closely guarded and is very small. They are devout Buddhists. And they do things like when they build a new building, they will excavate down several feet and preserve the life of each and every worm, ant, grub, etc. that lives there in the hope of preserving all forms of life. And they happen to have a happiness index. The OECD Better Life Indicators and the Legatum Prosperity Index. I'm only going to talk about one of these today, just to give you an idea. And I'm going to talk about the Social Progress Index. And this is built on something called design principles. And for those of you who use Apple products, design engineering, design principles drive everything that makes Apple what it is. The people at Stanford who teach these courses and where the real intellectual hub of this exists were the people who invented the mouse that you commonly use with your computer today. At any rate, they've moved beyond that and they've got this social progress index, and it's separate from economic indicators. They try to look at a holistic picture of what's going on in a community. They look at outcomes rather than just pure inputs and that sort of stuff. So it's very holistic and it's relevant to all countries. In this sense, it normalizes, those of you who are statisticians, across indices.
Quiz.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Hey, Kevin, if you could mute your mic, please.
I'm thinking about some o'clock, folks.
So what is social progress? This is a country's ability to meet its basic human needs, that it's providing the building blocks that allow for a sustainable society and allows for everybody to reach their full potential. And as you see, these 3, what I would call constructs, and that's a technical term, but 3 big ideas of basic human needs, foundations of well-being, and opportunity. And I'm going to highlight one country in just a moment here and talk about it. And I've had some firsthand experience with it recently. Costa Rica is the name of the country. But basic human needs, do they have things like universal health coverage? Are they working on things like their air and water quality? Is everybody housed? Then we talk about the next level. And you can think about this as sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs even. Do they have the foundations for well-being? Do they have access to education? Are there information and communication modes, etc.? Is the ecosystem of businesses, government agencies, and other social functions sustainable over time? And lastly, and maybe this is the apex of Maslow's, we might call self-actualization, do you have personal rights, freedoms, and access to things like higher education? So here are the SPI rankings for 2013, and not surprisingly, Sweden often comes in at the top of this. I attribute all of that to ABBA and IKEA, but what the hell. The next are Western European countries, the United Kingdom, Switzerland, then there's Canada and us. And then you have other more traditional, again, more developed, as I would call them, countries. Then you'll see down there at number 12 is Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a remarkable country. It's Central American. They did away with their army in the 1950s for the express purpose of doing two things: creating universal health coverage and universal education opportunities. So in Costa Rica, you can go to college for free, all the way through undergraduate education for free. And it's really quite remarkable. They do not have a standing army. They do have rather large police forces, I couldn't help but notice. They also have really progressive sustainability and environmental features. And for those of you who don't know, Costa Rica has a rainforest. It's actually got several microclimates, but rainforests, volcanoes, beaches on both sides. It borders both the Pacific and the Gulf of Mexico. And it's just remarkable. Other South American and Central American countries, both Chile and Argentina, do quite well on these things, the Dominican Republic, etc. So for some reason, we see that a lot of the countries in what we used to refer to as Latin America are doing quite well. So here we see the GDP per capita versus the social progress index. And this is rather interesting as a slide, in part because we who do a lot of statistics don't like to see curves in our lines that we fit. In other words, we want to see generally straight lines. And what this indicates to you in some regards is there is a point of diminishing marginal return. In other words, you look at the United Arab Emirates, and they've got a huge gross domestic product per individual. Yet if you look at their social progress index, they are below the line. So in a chart like this, it's far better to be above the line, because this is an indication that you are taking the resources you have available to you and making the best use of them. To be below the line is to be somewhat suboptimal. In other words, you are not fully using the resources that your community is garnering. And you'll notice in here we see lots of dictatorships and single rule countries. And that's not surprising, because in dictatorships and single party systems and communist systems, the wealthy or a single party tends to extract rents from society for their own well-being. And if you look here, you'll see a ton of those types of countries, Rwanda, Mozambique, etc. Just not good stuff. As we move into the next group, these are what I would call your developing countries. And as I pointed out earlier, Costa Rica is just doing a phenomenal job. Part of the way to think about this is how far is that dot away from the curve? And the further away from the curve you are, the better you're doing with using your resources. So it's really quite remarkable. Similarly, we see Sweden, the United Kingdom, Switzerland, and even the United States, despite our many problems, tends to be doing better than a lot of other countries. So as you can see, overall social progress index versus government expenditures is not highly correlated. In other words, there are things you can do to make your country better that don't just rely on wealth. And this goes all the way down to your community as well. We see lots of parts of America that are I wouldn't say impoverished, but less wealthy than other parts, and yet they seem to operate just fundamentally better. So what do we find from this study? Economic development is necessary, but not sufficient. And a matter of fact, some aspects of development are less effective than others in advancing social progress. And this is often counterproductive or counterintuitive even. One of the goals should be to have sustainable economic development. If you're destroying your environment as you economically develop, you're going to have problems. Okay. And again, I talked earlier about your distance from the curve. So we see these two countries, Paraguay and Egypt, that have about the same GDP per capita, but Paraguay has a far better standard of living. Interesting find. Here's sort of the big items that you'll see. And if you look at Paraguay again, you'll see that undernourishment and depth of food deficit continue to be issues. Things like rural-urban access are problematic, energy efficiency, etc. But they still do pretty well overall. And if you notice, they have a very high foundations of well-being score, as well as basic human needs. What they really need to be functioning on next is opportunity. But if I had to do things, I would do things the way Paraguay is actually progressing. I would start from the left and work toward the right. And I'm showing you a little bit of that there. So why social progress? It's driving to action. This actually gives you discrete items that you can work on as you move forward to try and improve the nature of your organization, whether that's a nation, state, a city, county, a corporation, your neighborhood, whatever it is. All of this is universal, and you can apply some of these. So the role of business, and this is non-trivial. There is this idea that only business can create wealth and prosperity, and there's probably something to that. Simply becoming a provider of raw resources will not create wealth and prosperity. Also, things like tourism. Simply being a tourist destination does not typically create wealth and prosperity. In other words, you need businesses that actually provide materials that people want and need. You have to produce something of value beyond just being in an enviable location. Businesses are facing increasing scrutiny on these topics as we go forward. And they're even trying to put in larger social policies, things like carbon taxes to influence the way corporations conduct their business, that sort of thing. So that all exists. The legitimacy of business has fallen. In other words, we no longer trust our corporations to behave as good agents for our society. At one time, Ford Motor Company, when it introduced the $5 a day wage, was considered a model organization. People across the United States looked to it as the model of the way any organization should be run. And that's simply not the case anymore. We have a very distinct suspicion of what companies do. With that said, governments and non-governmental organizations, NGOs, they lack sufficient resources and capabilities. Generally speaking, governments do not produce the goods and services that create wealth and prosperity. Instead, they generally tax and can often retard the development of those things, and that's a problem. So we need a new approach. Traditionally, and if you looked back into the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, there was a class of people called the robber barons. And this was things like Carnegie, Shell Oil, other companies. And these people tried to wash their images through philanthropy. And to this day, if you walk on the most college campuses, you'll find Rockefeller, Carnegie, and other names plastered across buildings as these people tried to improve their social standing. Then in the late 70s, early 80s, we moved to something called corporate social responsibility, where companies were expected to comply with community standards. And part of the problem with that was many corporations simply took their businesses to other countries where the community standards were either so low or non-existent. A couple of industries that spring to mind would be textiles. Up until the 80s, the United States was one of the largest textile producers, but companies quickly found that to comply with the OSHA, the workplace and other rules was prohibitively expensive, and they essentially moved a lot of that to Southeast Asia. More recently, corporate social responsibilities looked at green initiatives, things like sustainability and mitigating risk. But all of that is problematic too. So philanthropy is a challenge because that's dependent on people giving you money. And at some point, people can simply stop that. Corporate social responsibility is challenging because it assumes that the companies are willing to give you money. And that also is limited in some respect in that they can only give so much before they become non-competitive vis-a-vis their other firms in the marketplace. One good example, and I'll talk more about them later, is Ben & Jerry's. Ben & Jerry's has a very high sustainability, corporate social responsibility in terms of their pay structures, et cetera, sort of model. But it started to price them out of the market even, and we saw a lot of competitors come in underneath them at different points. So this new idea is creating shared value. And this is where we really partner with the communities where we work and live. And again, I know many of you aren't interested in healthcare per se, but in most communities, the hospital and health system are either the first or second largest employer, and that's generally behind the school district. And it's incredibly important that they be engaged with those communities in talking about what are our shared values and how does it really address our business model. Do you want to have clinics in underserved neighborhoods? That sort of question comes to mind. So you see, the the creating value framework is much more involved. It talks about things with improving the environment, actually mitigating the damage that is already in our community, increasing educational opportunities. That's an obvious no-brainer. Skills. This is different than education, and we see a lot of this going on today. Michael Rowe, is that his name? From Dirty Jobs has a big skills program where they teach people basic carpentry, electrical, plumbing, and other skills so that people who don't want to go on to higher education have opportunities to participate in the workforce. And that's a really good thing. And it's something we had a desperate need for. Health, this is things like taking care of the food deserts, et cetera. Worker safety, an ongoing problem, and especially during COVID-19, we saw this idea of worker safety and how is the worker safety going to forever change after COVID-19. Things like the cube farm may simply cease to exist, and we won't have that sort of open floor plan for corporations that was frankly cost effective, but probably wasn't even all of that business effective. Affordable housing. New York City is a prime example of places where the people who do the day-to-day operations, essential employees, live 50, 60 miles away and sometimes have an hour or two commute each direction because of the lack of affordable housing near where they work. That's a problem. Community economic development. This is an area where I really have to give kudos to Birmingham. They've really done a nice job in many areas of promoting businesses coming back into neighborhoods that were in decline or in disuse and backfilling them with locally owned and operated businesses. Water use continues to be an issue, as does energy use. So what are we going to do as a corporate partner? Well, there are things like non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and we want to work with them closely, as well we should. Governments, we need to partner with governments more than have this adversarial campaign that we typically do. Foundations, we need to move them off of just giving to their boutique topics and actually have them focus on a broader range of things. And we see many foundations have lost their way because some of the things that they were addressing are no longer actual health concerns. And competitors. How do we brand these social initiatives and partner with other people that are our competitors to actually improve the community around us without giving away our corporate advantages? So a lot of this involves changing the way we think about things. Nestle, fairly famous for its chocolate, started out as a chocolatiers family, as did Mars, which is a big company, and I'll talk about a Mars product here in a moment. But they moved from being a food and beverage company to being a nutrition company. And that's really changed the way they think about a lot of their products, including things like allergies and other features. Nike was a footwear company initially and just made running shoes. And now they're a health, fitness, and I would even tell you a lifestyle company. I can't help but notice the swoosh on lots of things that have little or nothing to do with actual fitness. So this is just people wearing it because it looks good or they think it looks good, those sorts of things. Thermo Fisher was a scientific and laboratory company, and now they're trying to make the word healthier. So one of these things you can think about is where you work, how do we reposition? Google, and I go back and forth on this, for many years had a corporate motto of do no evil. Yeah, that's not bad, but it's not positive either. And it really doesn't talk about what it is they do. If you look at the Amazon logo, you'll notice that the arrow points from the A in Amazon to Z. And that's because they wanted to provide every product a consumer might need from A to Z. And they put it into their logo. Just absolutely brilliant branding. I should have put a picture up. All right, moving on. So I won't harp too much on Nestle. They really focused on water, though, was one of the features. If you don't know this, in agriculture, particularly the production of things like milk, it takes hundreds of gallons of water to produce 1 gallon of milk. And they were very keen on this because Nestle had a lot of dairy products in their portfolio, and they wanted to reduce that water feature dramatically, and that involved a lot of recycling and other things. They ramped up the nutritional features on a lot of their food products in fairly dramatic ways. They found that they could cut half the sugar out of a lot of what they did, and even somebody with a fairly active sweet tooth like yours truly couldn't tell the difference. And rural development, a lot of the products they bought came from rural areas, yet they found that their employees and those people servicing those and that end of the value chain were just not doing well. Danone, a fairly famous maker of yogurt, has also done this. They even went as far as to sell off their beer, meat, and cheese units. They really focused again on dairy and water. Gone over that a little bit. And they wanted to talk about medical nutrition. And this is sometimes probiotics and other features that we know make for healthier eating. And they've done a really good job about it. You can look at the slide. So rethinking the purpose of a business. Instead of maximizing shareholder wealth, we're creating shared value for society, not just economic value for its own sake. Business acting as business. In other words, it's not us giving you something that's non-sustainable. It's building in the corporate DNA that we are part of your community. We're willing to give broader opportunities for economic value creation. Innovation, productivity, economic growth, I would tell you that's actually been around even before this idea. But we need to think about how to re-legitimize business as being something that people look at and say, yes, you're a valuable part of society. We want you to survive. So recent developments, and this is literally within the past month, corporate brands, corporate investments, and corporate practices. So let's think about a couple of these. The big ones, corporate branding. Uncle Ben's and Aunt Jemima have rightfully been taken to task. The people, again, who've been very good about this have been Ben and Jerry's for a long time. They have used their product to market and promote diversity, equity, inclusion, those sorts of ideas. This picture on the bottom left of Colonel Sanders dancing with Mrs. Butterworth. So this was cross-branding of what can only be said to be the worst idea ever. Maybe, I don't know. And the Kardashians are the worst idea ever, but this is pretty close second. Yes, somebody who's clearly racist dancing with a racist symbol. I just can't get over it. You'll notice the quote to the right, Uncle Ben's, this is actually owned by Mars M&M. The same people who give you M&Ms happen to own Uncle Ben's and all of that, and they're going to eliminate it. With that said, that's happening in 2020. We've known the story of Aunt Jemima and that it was purposely racist from the jump and sort of got worse as it went on for many years, and how it's only now that they're doing away with that. It's mind-boggling. Anyway. Corporate statements. So after George Floyd was killed, many people in the corporate world came out and made far more forceful statements about where their organization was going to be with respect to this and how they were going to behave. And in many ways, that's a good thing. I hope it's not just transitory where they're paying it lip service because it's in the news today, and they're actually going to do more things around that. And to that end, what are the things they can do? The biggest thing is change their own corporate cultures. To this day, in the same way racism is endemic to our society, it's endemic to most corporations in some way, shape, or form, as is sexism. By the way, I don't mean to give other issues short shrift, but while we're talking about diversity inclusion, and that includes women, of course, as well as other minority groups, it's just a big, big issue. Hiring practices have been around for a while, although I would tell you quota systems and other affirmative action programs often stigmatize from the jump, and that's problematic. Again, this goes back to culture. In other words, you shouldn't be stigmatizing people on the way in. You need to get rid of that. And the last big one, and this has actually been the area that I think has been the most profound in terms of its potential impact going down the road, is how these people source products and the fact that they're going to start making greater use of minority-owned businesses. The United States government for many years has been a leader in this and has tried very hard to give some benefits to those companies that do that. So I think if the larger corporate world will do that, that may be the thing that moves the market the most, other than changing their actual culture, which is no small feat. So with that said, I'm done. Any questions?
Professor Ford, can we talk about the assignment that's due this Saturday?
Which class are you in and which assignment?
Oh, sorry. I am in the 631 course, and it is assignment 1, where I can pull it up here too. I believe we're to track for 3 weeks the progress of someone's social media page, the company.
Certainly. I've had a few emails about this, and I know some of the people that were selected by students haven't posted as regularly as they wanted. This would be ideal. Feel free to go back into their history and talk about some of that. So just because the person you initially picked hasn't been active the past 2 weeks, it is summer, maybe they're on vacation, who knows. Yeah, you can either find somebody else, you can go back in their history and look at their posts. I guess those are the 2 easiest options, but either of those will suffice.
Perfect. No, thank you. That's helpful.
Other questions, other thoughts? So is there a certain format you want us to follow for the memo? Well, just the standard memo, to, or date, to, from, subject. Get that straight. That's usually useful. I'm a big fan of what I call bottom line up front bluff. Give me the big idea at the front or your solution, and then build your support behind that. And this is partially because when you get out in the workforce, I get emails, and an email is a memo effectively, by the way, that go on for paragraph and paragraph at some great length, and somewhere 600 or 700 words down is where the main point is. That's not useful for me as a manager. Go ahead, get your main point up front. Here's the problem. Here's my recommended solution. Here's the reasoning behind it, as well as some other alternatives you may wish to consider. And that's how you can best write a memo in the professional workplace.
Hello, Dr. Ford. This is Marla Kelly. I'm from one of the health. I'm from the health course. Quick question. In chapter 3, when we talk about service competitor service competitor analysis. Yes, there are some examples of forward integration and reverse integration. So forward integration, I understand. So, for example. Well, maybe that I got it backwards. I was thinking of CVS now becoming possibly a healthcare provider. So they sell pharmaceuticals, but now they're getting into the healthcare business and supplying clinic appointments and so forth. But I was looking for an example of reverse integration, or at least a successful example.
Certainly. So, for example, CVS, as you mentioned, they've branched out in a variety of ways. And what I call the clinics forward or backwards integration. So it depends how you think about the world. It used to be, I would go to the doctor, I would get a script, and they would then send me to CVS, right? So in some respects, that is reverse integration. I'm moving backwards to get people into the doctor's office or the clinic that then buys my services. So that's a form of backwards integration. And bearing in mind that when you start with retail, a retail outlet, that's usually the end point of the vertical integration chain.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay.
Thank you.
So let's see, what are some ideas you have in hiring processes to promote diversity? I think right now a lot of companies use questionnaires. Yes, questionnaires are problematic to meet quotas, but how can that be shifted to more inclusion? There are a variety of ways to do this. There's a lot of training programs going on right now. In the healthcare field, again, if you were to go to Houston, they have a high school dedicated to allied health. And a lot of that, because it's Houston, it's inner city schools. And they put this high school right down in MD Anderson, the University of Houston, Texas at Houston, that huge medical industrial complex. And guess what? They're training all these local kids in the magnet school for healthcare services. And they've essentially created their own pipeline for people local to the community that tend to come from underserved populations. And it's really a remarkable success story for that community. That's one example. And there's a lot of this sort of on-the-job training, reaching back into the community. And I hate to tell you this, I shouldn't say it, but in part, this has been the failure of higher education. And we're not providing people with the skills they need. A lot of times you'll see this in the tech field, where we're not very good at teaching people to code. So these companies will come together and create coding boot camps. And a lot of times they'll sort of look out into the workforce and say, well, where are the students that we're most likely to get? And they wind up in these, again, what we would generally consider underserved communities, and helping develop coding skills in neighborhoods that are having trouble. And it's really remarkable. So there's lots of ways to go after this problem if you really want to. For a long time, they used to call it the old boy network or the school ties kind of thing. And if you look at US presidents, like 7 of them were in Skull and Bones, Yale fraternity kind of stuff, which, you know, they were just the chosen people sort of thing. Getting away from that mindset is non-trivial. The other problem comes in the promotion and those sorts of features. And we do see a lot of issues with evaluation not being fair or equitable, and really not person-based, versus things that are, it's just problematic. A lot of the evaluation process beyond the initial, we're actually fairly good these days at getting people in. We're just not good at promoting them, getting them skilled, even within the companies. So that's an area for big improvement. Excuse me. As I said, though, we're seeing a lot of companies are putting things in to their, you know, standards. And again, I hate that they do it just by quota, but they're putting numbers out there where they look out into their community and they say, if we're going to map onto our community, we're going to have to do something to employ this many women, people from other socio-demographic groups, et cetera. So in some ways, it's a double-edged sword. Some ways it's good, some ways not so good. If they put in the educational and ongoing training programs to make it stick, it'll be good. All right, well, that gets us to about 45 minutes. I hope you all have a good week, and next week we'll see what happens in the world if it is still spinning, and we'll try to find another topic that relates to what's going on. Thank you and good night.